Hey guys, Pete here. I've been working on ideas for my Twin Peaks Season 1 rewatch series. This was the overwhelming favorite idea from my patrons on Patreon, so I've been thinking about it for over a week now. One key question that comes to mind is rooted in the end of Season 3. So if you haven't completed watching that yet, this will contain major spoilers. You're going to want to watch something else instead. With that out of the way, the question I'm referring to is, if Laura wasn't killed, then do the events of Season 1 and Season 2 of Twin Peaks still exist? This is a complicated question, and one we certainly can't answer conclusively. I'm going to be speculating, and I could be wrong. The only thing I'm sure of is that some of you will agree with my thinking, and some of you won't. It's just the nature of how the story has been told, and I'm okay with that. My initial reaction when watching the finale of Twin Peaks The Return was that after we saw Pete go fishing and Laura's body disappear from the shore, this would have meant that Laura was never murdered, and therefore Agent Dale Cooper would never have needed to travel to Twin Peaks to investigate in the first place. I mentioned as much in my first finale recap, but I've been thinking about it ever since. The evidence is clear here. We saw Cooper intervene, and we saw her body wrapped in plastic disappear. Pete never discovers the body, so he never calls the Twin Peaks sheriff, Harry S. Truman. What happens after he intervenes is what I think is the best evidence for the fate of the events of the original series, and I also think there are some pertinent clues in the secret history of Twin Peaks. I'm assuming if you're still watching this video, you've watched the return to conclusion, but that only some of you guys have actually read the secret history. The reason I went back to the book when thinking about this video was based on the idea that there were several discrepancies that fans quickly picked up on in the book after it was released. Like instantly afterwards, there were certain things that didn't add up and didn't match with what we saw in the first two seasons. For the most part, these were character details and some larger omissions like removing Annie Blackburn from Norma's family. These have been a mystery, and we're all waiting to learn more when the final dossier comes out next month, because Mark Frost has said that things will eventually make sense. After seeing Agent Cooper go back in time with the help of Phillip Jeffries, I immediately wondered if this could be the reason the secret history's discrepancies existed. Of course, it's not that simple because the murder of Laura Palmer is mentioned in the book. Agent Cooper's return from the Red Room and his meeting with Major Briggs occurs just as we saw it at the end of Season 2 and heard it referred to in Season 3. So the universe that the book exists in has the murder of Laura Palmer involved. Of course, there could be a chance that when the final dossier comes out, all the references to that will be gone, but I really think that's unlikely. What I also think is unlikely is that David Lynch and Mark Frost as a team writing the story, and then David Lynch directing the story on his own after they came up with the whole idea of the return. I just think it's super unlikely that they would have made this alternate version of history that doesn't include their first big collaboration, which was a very popular and successful thing when it happened, and that is Twin Peaks Season 1 and Season 2. And I am getting ready to do my rewatch, as I mentioned, so does that stuff still exist? There have been plenty of different, really good kind of theories that are out there after the return finished up about what actually happened at the end. One part that isn't necessarily fleshed out in any of those because it's not the most major thing that happens is that idea of what happened to Twin Peaks, the original one, the story that we liked, the one that all those characters used to inhabit. If the timeline changed and Laura was never murdered, that doesn't mean that she never existed, or for instance, that Harry S. Truman was never the sheriff in Twin Peaks, or that any of those characters ever existed. I mean, that stuff's pretty obvious, I think, to everyone, that Twin Peaks still exists. There's just an alternate version of the reality there where we don't have all those characters coming together, especially Agent Dale Cooper, in the investigation of Laura's murder. So is that reality? Like, is what happened after he went back in time that murder never happened? Or is it something else? I tend to think that it's something else. So I don't have a smoking gun, but like I said, I just don't think Frost and Lynch would erase that whole memory of this thing that we were all a part of. And there's other stuff as well. Most fans spent the majority of season 3 waiting for Agent Cooper to return, and he was in the Red Room for 25 years in that reality. So what was he doing? He was doing stuff, right? He wasn't just sitting there. I mean, he could have just been sitting there, but we kind of have some hints later on that he was interacting with Diane and maybe some other things. So to think that he was just basically in limbo for 25 years seems pretty unlikely. We also know that Major Briggs had been hibernating, as he told Bill Hastings, and we can see that he had some influence over events as well. What's the best reason that I think that this wouldn't have happened that way, that Twin Peaks Season 1 and Season 2 still do exist, and in fact that is the actual real timeline, and the one that he went back to alter is actually an alternate timeline? Are you following? Well, I think it is because while he was in the Red Room, being Agent Cooper for 25 years, when he came out, he understood what the plan was. He still had the same plan that we heard Gordon Cole refer to when he explained it to Albert and Tammy. He didn't explain it to us, or he didn't explain the details, but he did explain that there was a plan. It involved Briggs, it involved Agent Cooper, and it was already in motion before the 25-year gap. So when Cooper came back, he was following a plan. He was doing things that he had started and had continued to work on while he was gone, in my opinion. So if we're thinking about this character that everyone loves, I feel like he wouldn't have gone back and changed history if that would have meant that everything would have disappeared from before. When time travel exists in a story, it's difficult because it creates a lot of paradoxes, which we all learned about when we watched Back to the Future however many years ago. What really shouldn't have happened, though, was that Cooper shouldn't have made a decision that would drastically change everything. What he should have done is he should have made a decision that went along with his plan that Gordon Cole knew about, that we realized that Phillip Jeffries knew about since he aided him, and that had a real purpose, which was to defeat Judy. It wasn't about saving Laura because Laura needed saved. Agent Cooper understood that Laura was a tool created by the firemen. So that's kind of really important when we look at this. Cooper wouldn't do it. The other things that we have to think about as well are the way that Briggs explained what he was doing to Bill Hastings and Ruth Davenport. We know that in Season 2, Major Briggs was abducted. He went to what we assume was the White Lodge, based on his own description. In The Secret History, we learn a lot more about that, and so I went back and I went through what he described, and he does a very thorough description of the way that time was. And we saw this in the 3rd season when he came and gave the canister to his wife to hold on to for the future events. We saw this where he had shown Bobby as a child where Jack Rabbit's palace was, how to open the canister, so on and so forth. In Dougie Milford's farewell letter to Major Briggs, whenever he was getting ready to leave the project he didn't know he was going to die. He knew that Briggs had disappeared. He was going to marry Lana, and he was going to step back at that point from listening post-alpha. Mark Frost put a lot of time into this because this is the final chapters of The Secret History, so he went to great detail to explain what Milford thought at the end of all of his years of chasing after this unknown phenomena, what he wanted Briggs to do, and it wouldn't make sense to do all of that just to put out another book 9 months or a year later that erases it all from history. So circumstantial evidence, sure, but I think it's still rather important. Now, the fireman's plan is probably the one thing that is kind of gone into pretty deeply in the better theories that are out there about season 3. We also have the log lady and everything that she said to Hawk in season 3, and her insistence that Laura was the one. Well, it could be pretty straightforward in that Laura was the one who was meant to stop all the evil that's been lurking around the woods in Twin Peaks since anyone can remember. We know pretty conclusively now that that all came from Judy. We had episode 8 that kind of showed that. We had what happened at the end. And yeah, I mean, Gordon Cole gave us the answer. Judy was an extreme negative force that had to be stopped, and they had a plan to do that. The fireman theory that I really think is closest to correct as far as what Frost and Lynch were thinking about when they wrote the story is the one where when they cross over, they go into a pocket dimension or an alternate reality, and that's when they face Judy at the very end of episode 18. Now, you don't have to agree with that theory to agree with the idea that whatever Cooper was doing there and wherever he was doing that to follow the fireman's plan. So if we look at the time when he went back to save Laura, or at least what looked like saving Laura, what he could have actually been doing is just causing that timeline to skew. We saw Sarah Palmer, who we all pretty much agree was being inhabited by Judy at the end, stabbing at the photo of Laura as the screen was sort of glitching out and things were changing. And that kind of does look a lot like she would be following after Laura into this other dimension if the fireman had set it up. So based on those things, based on what have sort of always seemed like the most important characters to the mythology side of things to me, which are obviously the giant fireman, the log lady, Major Briggs, and Phillip Jeffries, they all seem to be working towards that same goal. And I don't know why we need to erase season 1 and season 2 from the timeline in order to say that their plan would have been different somehow. You know what I mean? Like, I just think it all sort of points to that stuff is still real, but whenever Cooper went with Phillip Jeffries and used the infinity clock or whatever you want to call it and goes back and pulls Laura, it was all part of the plan to get Judy to chase her somewhere where they could finally face her head on. The idea between Briggs and Jeffries' time travel shows that once you go across, things do not necessarily go in a straight line, certainly not a linear timeline. So all of that stuff could have been arranged at any time over the last 25 years. If you remember from Firewalk with Me, Jeffries basically goes on a 2-year skip when he goes from Buenos Aires to Philadelphia. So we know that when they're jumping around, we don't know a whole lot about the coordinates other than their portals, but we notice that whenever they pass through, time doesn't behave normally. And like I said, Mark Frost went into great detail about what Major Briggs thought happened to him in his trip to the White Room or the White Lodge. So him going back in time and plucking Laura doesn't really screw things up that much if it's done in that way. The other thing we have to keep in mind is the development of the story and the mythology. When they were writing season 1, they may have had no real idea about any of this stuff. A lot of it kind of seems like they made it up as they went along as far as the lodges and different things are concerned. So I think if they're interjecting this idea whenever they're coming up with the idea of season 3 and what it's about and how it ends, I really don't see it coming up that, hey, let's destroy the first 2 seasons just to piss off all the fans. You know what I mean? Like, I think instead that they just elaborated on this plan. This plan happened. It needed to accomplish this thing of taking care of Judy, and all of this stuff sort of built out from that. But like I said right at the beginning, I could be wrong because it's all speculation, and I'm really interested to see what you guys have to think. So this is the primer. Episode 1 is the next Twin Peaks video I'm going to do. That's going to be my rewatch. So definitely give this video a like. definitely come over and think about joining in on the Patreon. I don't think these videos are going to get a lot of views. The Twin Peaks hype has died down, so it's mostly going to be the more diehards that are going to watch. And I love the idea of doing the rewatch all the way through, but at this point, I have to be honest that I think that those people who have already came over to the Patreon are basically making this happen, and I really want to thank everybody who's come over there to help out, because I'm a paycheck to paycheck YouTuber, you know what I mean? Like, I have to make enough to cover my expenses, or else I have to go do something else besides make YouTube videos. So please think about that. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please follow me on Twitter, subscribe to my channel. Definitely give me your ideas in the comments. And thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you soon.